You're 65, you've got a £250,000 pension pot, and you think you've got about 10 years of retirement ahead. That number is off by a decade. Here's the first mistake almost everyone makes. Most people planning their retirement use the average life expectancy for someone born the same year they were, which for a man in the UK sits around 79. But you didn't just get born, you made it to 65. And once you're standing at 65, the maths changes completely. The most recent ONS national life tables put a 65-year-old man's life expectancy at around 84 and a 65-year-old woman's at around 86. That's not 10 years of retirement. That's closer to 20. Now for the second mistake, and this one is quieter but just as expensive. While you're planning for the wrong number of years, your pension is probably still sitting in whatever fund it landed in on day one, the default fund. Most default funds have spent the last decade lagging behind a plain index tracker, sometimes by a wide margin. Two mistakes. One about how long your money needs to last. The other about how hard that money is actually working. Both of them are quietly eating into the retirement you think you've got. Stick with me for the next few minutes, and I'll walk you through both numbers properly and what you can actually do about each one, starting with the mistake that catches almost everybody off guard. If you're heading towards 65 and you don't want to run out of money before you run out of time, hit subscribe. I put out a new video like this every week. So let's start with the biggest surprise. Your retirement is probably 20 years, not 10, and that changes everything that comes next. A 65-year-old man in the UK today has a remaining life expectancy of around 84, according to the most recent ONS national life tables. A woman at 65 can expect to reach about 86. That's a retirement of somewhere between 19 and 21 years. Not the 10 or 14 years most people quietly assume when they picture the finish line. The gap between what you assume and what's actually likely is where the trouble starts. Most retirement calculators, and most people's gut instinct, use the life expectancy figure you'd get if you were born today, somewhere around 79 for a man. That number includes everyone who doesn't make it to 65 at all, so it drags the average down. Once you've actually reached 65, all of that is behind you, and the number that matters is the one measured from here. It's 5 or 6 years longer than the figure most people are quietly using to plan. Take Dave and Sarah. Both turned 65 this year, both just retired, with a combined pension pot of £300,000 and the full new state pension between them. When they first sat down and did the sums, they used the number they'd always heard. Roughly 10 years of retirement, and worked out they could comfortably spend around £30,000 a year and be fine. Then they found out the real length of their retirement was closer to 20 years, not 10. Suddenly the same pot has to stretch twice far. This is the part nobody explains properly. It isn't just that you might live longer, it's that most people's income doesn't start on day one of retirement. The state pension age is climbing from 66 towards 67, so if you stop working at 65, there can be a year or two where you're living entirely off your own pot before the state pension arrives at all. For a couple aiming for the kind of moderate, comfortable retirement the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association describes, around £43,100 a year for two people, 2 years of that bridge period alone comes to roughly £86,000 funded entirely from savings before a penny of state pension shows up. There's a trade-off here that almost nobody says out loud. If you spend as though you've got 10 years left when you've actually got 20, you won't notice the mistake in year 1, or even year 5. You'll notice it in year 12 or 13, when the pot is running dry and you're 77 or 78, with a decade of retirement still ahead of you and no obvious way to fund it. That's the real cost, and it doesn't show up on a bank statement today. It shows up as a phone call to a financial advisor in your late 70s, asking what your options are. I used to make this exact mistake with my own numbers. I looked up life expectancy once, saw a figure around 79, and built a rough plan around it. It took me 2 years and a proper look at the official tables to realize I'd been planning for a retirement that was 5 or 6 years shorter than the one I was actually likely to have. It's an easy mistake to make. Nobody teaches you to look past the headline number. You're not careless for thinking 79 was the right figure to use. It's the number that gets repeated everywhere. But now you know the real one, and there's still time to adjust before it matters. Even if you get this part exactly right and plan for the full 20 years, there's a second mistake sitting quietly inside your pension statement that could be costing you tens of thousands of pounds, and most people never even look for it. Research from the investment platform AJ Bell found that 91% of UK pension funds underperformed a simple FTSE all-share tracker over the last 10 years. Not by a whisker either. Most of them lagged by a meaningful margin. If your pension has been sitting in whatever fund it landed in on the day you joined your workplace scheme, there's a strong chance it's one of them. This isn't because anyone is trying to shortchange you. Default funds are built to be cautious for the average member, which usually means holding more in bonds and cash than a 65-year-old who still has 20 years of investing ahead of them actually needs. On top of that, most default funds are still run by a fund manager making active decisions, which costs more than simply tracking the market. Auto-enrollment default funds are capped by law at a maximum charge of 0.75% a year. A plain global index tracker, the kind that just holds every major company in the world in proportion to its size, can be bought for around 0.13% a year. That's a gap of roughly 0.6 percentage points every single year for as long as your money stays invested. That doesn't sound like much on its own. Fees don't just take a slice once, they take a slice every year, and because your pot is growing, that slice grows with it. Run that 0.6 percentage point gap over 20 years on a £300,000 pot, with no extra money going in at all, and the difference in what you end up with can come to well over £100,000. Same contributions, same market, same amount of risk taken. The only thing that changed is where the money was sitting. There's a trade-off most people never think about. Staying in the default fund feels like the safe choice, because it's the choice that requires nothing from you. But doing nothing is still a decision, it's just one made by default, in every sense of the word. The long-term cost of that inaction doesn't show up as a scary number on your annual statement. It shows up as a smaller pot. 10 or 15 years from now, and you'll never know exactly how much was left on the table because the comparison never gets made. Checking this takes about 15 minutes, and you don't need to move your whole pot to do it. Log into your pension provider's own account online, look for the section on fund choices or switching funds, find the ongoing charge, sometimes called the OCF, for the fund you're currently in, and compare it to a simple global tracker fund inside the same pension. If your current fund is charging close to that 0.75% cap and hasn't matched a plain index over the last 5 years, that's worth a proper look. Some people choose to move the bulk of their pot into a lower-cost tracker and keep a smaller portion somewhere steadier. But that balance depends on your own comfort with risk, not a rule that fits everyone the same way. I did exactly this with my own pension. It took about 12 minutes from logging in to confirming the switch. I'm not saying it's the only thing worth doing with your pension, but out of everything I've looked at, it was the single highest impact change for the least amount of effort. Switching to a better fund only protects you if the timing of a market fall doesn't catch you at the worst possible moment. For anyone retiring in the next few years, that timing risk matters more than almost anything else we've covered so far. There's a risk that has nothing to do with which fund you're in, and everything to do with when you retire. It's called sequence of returns risk, and it's the reason two people can retire with the exact same size pot, take out the exact same amount each year, and end up in completely different positions 10 years later, purely because of when the market happened to fall. The mechanism is simple once you see it. If your pot drops sharply in the first few years of retirement, right when you've just started taking money out, you're selling investments at a low price to fund your living costs. That leaves less money in the pot to benefit when the market eventually recovers. If the same size drop happens 10 years into retirement instead, you've got a much bigger cushion to absorb it, and you're not selling as large a share of the pot at the bottom. In 2008, the FTSE 100 fell by around 31%. Picture someone who retired that year with a £300,000 pot, taking out £12,000 a year to top up their income. Within about a year, that pot could have dropped by close to a third, and every withdrawal after that was coming out of a much smaller base, right at the point it could least afford it. Someone who retired 5 years earlier, or 5 years later, with the exact same pot and the exact same withdrawals, would have ridden through that same crash from a completely different position. This matters to you specifically if you're heading into retirement in the next year or two, and your pot is sitting in a default fund with a heavier weighting toward the stock market than you realize. A sharp fall in the first few years isn't a distant, theoretical risk in that situation. It's the exact window you're about to walk into. You can't control when the market falls. Nobody can. But there are two things you can control: how much you take out each year and where that money is actually invested. Those are the two levers that decide whether a bad first few years derails the whole plan or barely makes a dent. The first lever is your withdrawal rate, meaning how much you take out of your pot each year. A common starting point is 4%. On a £300,000 pot, that's £12,000 a year. Add that to the full new state pension for a couple, which comes to around £25,000 a year combined, and you're looking at roughly £37,000 a year in total income. That's a reasonable, sustainable position, but it sits below the £43,100 a year the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association says a couple typically needs for a moderate, comfortable retirement. Closing a gap like that usually comes down to a bigger pot, some part-time income for a few years, or a lower spending target. There's no trick that makes the gap disappear on its own. The second lever is the fund switch we already covered. Move the money that doesn't need to sit in bonds and cash into a lower-cost, better-performing fund using the same 15-minute check. Look at the ongoing charge, compare it to a simple global tracker, and see whether the fund you're in has actually kept pace with the market over the last 5 years. The third piece, and this is the one people skip most often, is a cash buffer. Keep somewhere around 1 to 2 years of essential spending sitting in cash or a low-risk account, completely separate from your invested pot. That way, if the market drops in year 1 or 2 of retirement, you're not forced to sell investments at a loss just to pay ordinary bills. You wait it out using the cash and let the invested portion recover in its own time. Remember Dave and Sarah from earlier. They had the £300,000 pot, but no cash buffer at all. When the market dipped by around 10% last year, they had to sell part of their pension at a loss just to cover a few months of bills. A cash buffer of even £20,000 would have meant they never had to touch the invested portion during that dip. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet open, working out that a 0.6 percentage point fee difference, left alone for 20 years, was worth more than £100,000 on a pot that size. I actually laughed out loud. I'd been paying a version of that fee for the better part of a decade without ever sitting down to work out what it actually cost me. If any of this has made you rethink what's sitting in your own pension, hit subscribe. I cover one part of UK retirement planning like this every week. If you've listened to all of this and still haven't opened your pension account to check any of it, you're not lazy, and you're not unusual. Most people know they should look, and most people still put it off. Part of it is the fear of finding out something uncomfortable. You've been paying into that pension for 20 or 30 years. Sitting down and discovering it's been in the wrong fund the whole time, or that you've been planning for the wrong number of years, feels like admitting a mistake you can't undo. So it's easier not to look. There's also a quieter belief sitting underneath that, the sense that it'll probably work out fine on its own, because it always has so far. I understand that completely. Nobody wants to open a statement and feel behind. But every person I've talked to who has actually gone through this check has said some version of the same thing afterwards. They wish they'd done it years earlier, not that they wished they'd never looked. There's a difference between avoiding a problem and not having one. Most of the time, the pension turns out to be fine, or fine with one small adjustment. The discomfort is in not knowing, not in what you actually find once you look. Think of it a bit like a car you've been driving for 30 years without ever checking the oil. It's probably fine most of the time. But a 15-minute check every few years is what stops a small, cheap fix from turning into a much bigger, much more expensive one later. You're not being asked to overhaul anything today. You're being asked to look, and that's a much smaller thing than it feels like right before you do it. So let's bring this together with a simple plan you can actually start. Here's where that leaves you. Mistake 1. Planning for a 10-year retirement when the real number, for most people reaching 65 today, is closer to 20. That single gap in the maths is what causes people to either overspend early or underspend out of fear for the whole stretch. Mistake 2. A default pension fund that's quietly cost the average saver a meaningful chunk of growth compared to a low-cost global tracker, for no extra risk taken and no extra money put in. Neither of these takes months to fix. A proper look at your real-life expectancy takes a few minutes. A fund check takes about 15. Add a cash buffer on top, and you've closed both gaps without changing how much you save or how hard you work between now and the day you stop. If this was useful, subscribe, and thanks for watching.